So today we're going to cover the exciting topic, for me, exciting topic of theory of change and how do we actually utilize this amazing tool for impact, for actually helping us map impact in our organizations and in particular, our for-profit enterprises. Just give me a second. I'm just letting other people pop in here. And so this is a really big topic, of course. We only have an hour or less than an hour. So we might not get to everything or to get to all of your answers. But we'll try to get as much as possible into this short period of time. So who is Ideas for Impact and who am I? So my name is Joanna Buczkowska-McCumber. Should go by she, her. I run an organization, a company called Ideas for Impact. We're a certified B Corp and 100% women owned. We are an impact and sustainability focused consulting agency that also does a lot of work in the space of climate intelligence and content. Our work very much sort of centers around making sure that every organization and every leader and every team is really able to work with impact in the best way possible. And what does that actually mean? It means that you can actually realize the impact that you seek to have, whether that's through a product you're selling, a service you're delivering, or even for some cases, a program that you're trying to build out or a full organization that you're trying to launch. So we do everything from strategic planning to impact framework development. Sort of the theory of change and a lot of that work really falls under that impact framework development work that we do, communication strategy that aligns with that impact framework development for companies and organizations. And then we do a lot of work actually in developing training, customized training, as well as sort of specialized leadership training around the topics of impact, on the topics of sustainability, and specifically thinking and really diving into the idea that in this new world, we have a massive sustainability and impact skills gap at the majority of organizations and companies. How do we actually bridge that gap? How do we give everybody the tools and the skills to be able to not only sort of, make it through that era, but actually be able to thrive in their roles, in their organizations, et cetera. And so that is a lot of the work that we do. We work with clients across many regions. We work with corporate clients. We work with impact investing funds and other sort of capital providers, as well as regional organizations and nonprofits. Now, today, what are we going to cover? So we've got a pretty busy, next 55 minutes. As I mentioned, you've got questions about any of this, about what I talk about the processes that I mentioned, please pop that into the chat, or if you want, you can also use the raise your hand option. You can pop off mute and ask that question as we go along. What we're going to cover in this session is we're going to talk about how we utilize the theory of change in strategic planning. We're going to dive into then how we actually build what we call a logic model, which is really the foundational piece of any theory of change that is developed or a process that is developed. We're going to dive a little bit into how you yourself could think about developing a theory of change model within your own organization or within your own team. It doesn't necessarily have to be organization-wide. You can do it at a team level or a product level. We're then going to dive into how to actually identify your impact narrative. And that's really what flows from a theory of change. How do we then articulate and visualize what we talk about that sometimes can feel very theoretical in nature, that can feel very ambiguous? How can we make it really related to the human experience? And then last, but certainly not least, we're going to talk about how the theory of change is actually, yes, a tool, but it's more importantly a framework that lives on. And it's more than a visualization. It's more than a narrative that we write. It's actually a way of doing our work around impact that is ongoing and actually allows us to create impact in a much more meaningful and effective way. So lots to cover. but first, how and why, I'm just gonna let a few folks into this session here. Whoops, we skipped over one bit. Okay, oops. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so first I want to sort of place some guardrails and create some context around how we're going to talk about theory of change and what it is that we're actually talking about, right? An important distinction is that, theory of change and logic models have been used in the nonprofit sector for quite a bit of time, and that's where really the methodologies and where a lot of this work and examples come from, which has been amazing. It's been an incredible tool for us to actually be able to map out the impact that we seek to achieve and how to do it in a way that's systematic, effective, and evidence-based. Now, as we have seen, there's a lot more, rightfully so, companies and organizations that are creating for-profit models that want to create impact just as much as a nonprofit might. Whether that's a startup or a larger corporation, an innovation unit within a corporation, or even a venture capital fund, if they seek to create impact in the world, how can we actually utilize a tool like theory of change for that environment, right? So that is a lot of the work that we do, is we work with for-profit entities to actually help them realize that impact in a meaningful way. And so we utilize a tool like the tool and the process of developing theory of change for that purpose. Now, the theory of change, it's a theoretical model, essentially. It's an ability for us to both map out and visualize the specific pathway that we want to create a desired change in the world, an impact that we want to see in the world. And ultimately, at least in our experience and what we've seen in the ecosystems, that it allows us, when it's incorporated into this process of strategic planning, it actually helps us create the baseline for strategic planning, not only to achieve, financial and growth metrics and goals, but for us to actually be able to achieve those impact goals much more effectively than if we had nothing at all, than if strategic planning happened without this tool and this planning process. And so a lot of ways, this is a dynamic blueprint for any organization to utilize. And as I mentioned before, we'll talk about how this becomes a living framework for anybody to utilize. And I do want to sort of stress the point that this is a theoretical model, right? Like with anything, we're trying to imagine how we're going to get to that impact or systems change that we have identified. And so we're creating a model of cause and effect to actually be able to get there. And in this instance, and what we're going to talk about today, is really like, how do we do this in a for-profit environment when we do have multiple different priorities that we're trying to meet, specifically around the tensions around creating, revenue, tensions around sales. How do we actually match those with impact and the impact goals that we might have? And so those are really important. But how does the theory of change actually work for us in the for-profit environment, in a way that that we can leverage to our own sort of benefit for that growth of the organization or the company or that impact? Well, the theory of change, because it allows us to really map everything out, it allows us to clarify not only our pathway, but the purpose. Like, why are we here and what are we doing and what are we doing this for, right? So it does allow us to clarify that purpose. Because it allows us to do that, and because we have a much clearer path to achieving that purpose, we're able to drive growth, whether that's from sort of this combination of revenue and impact. We're able to do it more effectively and efficiently. And so it allows us to drive growth with utilizing our resources much more effectively, resources like, financial resources, raw materials, individuals, capital, knowledge, etc. Because the model really is effective at sort of building out and identifying the assumptions that we might have within that process or the pathway we identify, it naturally fosters adaptability. And so it should also be said, if you're using this, it will foster adaptability. If you don't, then, if you do it once and you don't actually ever look at it, then it'll be very hard to be adaptable. So again, this is part of this like becoming living model perspective. It allows us to build trust with our interest holders. So everybody that's engaged, from customers to our employees to our investors, whoever that might be, because we're now actually clearly articulating how we're getting to that impact that we say we're going to achieve. It builds naturally trust because we're sharing that pathway and that logic with everybody else. And then lastly, but certainly not least, because of all of this, it does enhance our credibility because we're sharing that process. We're saying this is actually how we're going to reach this impact, exactly how we're thinking about it, how we're measuring it. It enhances our credibility as an organization, but also enhances our credibility as an organization trying to create impact. And so what we're seeing a lot more in just the market in general is we're obviously seeing a surge of impact investing funds, of social finance capital funds coming on the market, and they're more and more looking for companies having actual evidence-based models of how they're going to achieve the impact that they seek to have, right? It's not just about like, we're going to, sell this product or build this technology and we're going to grow exponentially. If we're trying to get funding from an impact investor or even a capital provider that has impact as a priority, they want to see how not only are you going to grow, but how are you actually going to achieve the impact that you claim you're going to have. So this is a great way to actually be able to model that and then actually share that with others. So let's get to it. So theory of change in the simplest form. Again, we could talk about all the theories about like what the theory of change is and how we're going to get there. At the end of the day, the theory of change has the most simple methodology. It's trying to articulate, if we do one thing, then we're going to achieve some kind of an outcome. That, in the fundamental terms, that is a theory of change. If we're able to actually run all our various experiments in our company, our various parts of the theory of change through this very simple test. If I do this, then this outcome will happen, or then this system change, this will lead to the system's change. It's a great way. If you get overwhelmed with everything that we're sharing, if you take anything away from this entire hour, it's you can do this on your own and you can just say, hey, if I do this, then this will happen. Because that is a thesis, right? If I, sell this product, or if I create this program and deliver it, if I run this service with this group of individuals or in this region, then this will happen. Do you actually have evidence to prove that that is right, or are you making assumptions along the way? And that is fundamentally what the theory of change is and allows us to do in this longer pathway as we build companies and organizations and impact funds that are actually trying to achieve that impact that we claim we're having. So our strategic planning approach is a lot because it is strategic planning and it's quite an intensive process. As I mentioned, this process is embedded. Theory of change modeling typically gets embedded in a bigger strategic planning process. This can last, a day, multiple days, a week, over periods of time, a couple months, where we're going back and forth on these various processes. But ultimately, our strategic planning process is a whole system where we look at the company or organization all the way from the top, from the core, what we call the core identity, our vision, mission, value system, our impact sort of mechanism, which is that theory of change, all the way down to those operational level structures that need to be there in order for impact to be realized, because we need to run the company, we need to run the fund, we need to run the organization. And so all of these pieces fall into place as we get working with the companies or organizations that we're working with. And I should also say, we do a lot of this with of course, our private clients. This is actually the first time we're running like a public webinar around this. We just have been getting so many questions around, how do you utilize a theory of change in the for-profit environment? And so we were just super excited to be able to deliver this publicly and, share our notes, share our, experience. And hopefully you will take some of this away. And we're going to be there, of course, for any support that you might need, if you need any. So again, this is our approach. This is where our theory of change work really fits in. Again, it's sort of sandwiched in the middle the way that we do work, we sort of go back and forth. It's an iterative process. It never is linear, although like what you'll see, there's a lot of linearity to the models, to how we look at things. But when we actually put it into practice, when we actually run workshops, when we actually run exercises with organizations or teams, we're going back and forth to be able to, again, test everything again against that like very simple question of, if we do this, then this happens. Are we right or are we wrong? Are we missing something? Are we making big assumptions around any part of this process? And so, again, it fits into the middle of our work on any strategic planning endeavor. And I wanted to share a couple examples of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about theory of change. Because the model is so unique, I mean, the model and the theory is sort of applicable to so many different scenarios. The way that you actually apply it to your own organization or team or product or service is unique to you. So what we'll see often is like we can do a theory of change at the bigger organizational level. We can do it per product. We can do it by service. We could do it by a specific like innovation model that a company or organization wants to create in their work. And so it's a very malleable process, and it's great for that because we can apply it to the smallest, what we call in the nonprofit world is called intervention, right? We can apply it to the smallest intervention all the way to the larger ones that we really think about at the sort of like organizational or systems level. This is a great example of a very, simple theory of change model that's literally what you'll see a mirror of a logic model, which is a tool that we use to really vision our theory of change. This is another example of a BC impact fund called InBC. You'll see, again, there's linearity here, but it starts getting a little bit more creative. The theory of change is a great opportunity to, again, because you're likely, if you're doing this, likely will be sharing it. Maybe you're not sharing it publicly, but you might be sharing it internally with your team, perhaps with your investors, perhaps with others that are grantors. You might want to have it prepared so that you can easily share it with others. So as another example of a Bell Music Therapy organization that's like much more creative in nature. We get into ones that are a little bit more abstract and creative, a lot of the times reflecting the organizational nature of perhaps that particular organization or company. And then another one where we get really theoretical and creative. Again, love this example of one that really takes into heart, that big underlying foundation of if and then into actually like that is the theory of change that they're looking at, because it does come back down to this very simplistic statement that they're making about the work that they do. So for the theory of change, utilizing it in the strategic planning process, and embedding it into that process with your team, investors, whoever is involved in that process. What makes it wonderful is that it actually moves away from just like, what are we doing, to why are we doing this work, right? We often have these conversations, I would say, like in the nonprofit world, but in the for-profit world, we have these conversations very much related to just like revenue. Why are we doing this? For the customer. But if we're actually trying to create impact through the products or services that we're selling and the company that we're building, why are we doing this? It's not just for the revenue generation or the market value of that company. There's a real impact value here too that we need to consider when we're building impact into the work that we do, so that we're actually able to reach that impact effectively. And again, when we look at the bigger picture, the strategic planning process, again, we make sure that it's layered within all of this and that it cascades down. If we're actually articulating that our theory of change and our mechanism of impact is a certain pathway, does it actually show up in our bigger organizational goals? Does it show up in our KPIs that we have for product development, for research and development, for for sales or marketing. If it's not, we need to reevaluate why that actually is the case. And we should also make a note that when we do this work, there's a bit of teasing out where even in the sort of traditional nonprofit model or organizations, we need to tease out, where our theory of change sort of layers, and that's why it's sandwiched, versus where our operational capacity and our operational goals live, right? A lot of the times, one of the sort of mistakes that teams will make, and it's not a mistake, we just need to throw all ideas out on the wall, but they will start putting very much operational components into a theory of change. Because they feel that like that's the key activity, but that is not it, right? We need to run operations no matter what happens, no matter what impact that we're trying to achieve, right? We need to have financial management, we need to have marketing, we need to have all these other aspects. And so how do we actually incorporate that effectively without eroding that impact pathway? So how do you actually build this into your own organization? Whatever, your structure. And again, you can utilize this in any kind of scenario, whether it's a, purely for-profit, high growth startup or a fund or even, a social enterprise or cooperative. We're still looking at the same elements. Those still exist and are true. And what we utilize in theory of change to do this work and to map out everything that we're doing is what we call a logic model. And it's just as by definition, it's a logical way for us to map out the process, or rather the pathway of actually creating and realizing the impact that we want to see. And we typically start with the end. So we start with that bigger impact that we're envisioning, or the systems change that we're trying to envision through our particular, not intervention, but our intervention is now a product or a service, right? The company that we're trying to build, or an investment for that matter. We want to find clarity in that structure that we're going to be building. We want to make sure that, and we're going to articulate this more and more, is this focus on the cause and effect relationship, as in that statement, if I do this, then this happens. That is very much a cause and effect. We want to look at that cause and effect throughout the model that we build. And again, we can build this at a company level, but we also need to look at it at a product level. And so often we can build those at multiple levels, our bigger organizational theory of change or logic model, and then like, how does this actually look for this particular product or product line or service, etc. So, oops, this didn't pop up properly. Apologies, they look, hold on, let me see if I can't see those. Give me 1 second here. Let's see what's going on with this. So strange. Okay, hold on. Yes, yes. Perfect. Sorry, everybody. Just give me 1 second. I'm trying to see what's going on with that. Make sure. Okay, there we go. Trying to animate it. That's why. Sorry about that. Okay, let's see how we can. Oh, it's just not doing it. Okay, that's unfortunate. Okay, that's. Sorry about that, everyone. Promise we've never had this. Sorry, everyone. Some technical difficulties because this one's want to show you this, but let me see if I can do it in a different way. Okay, here we go. Here we go. There we go. Okay, we'll do this so that you can see it actually, because otherwise it doesn't make sense if I'm talking about it. All right. Sorry about that for a second. Okay, so can everybody see the logic model now? So, okay. So I wanted to make sure that we had this with the actual titles, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense for me to have white squares on for you, because these are the critical elements of the logic model that essentially make up your theory of change. And if you remember in the very first example that I gave you from Good and Well, they actually utilize this kind of modeling as their theory of change. And we see this actually quite a lot for those that don't necessarily want to, visualize their model in a more elaborate way or in a more creative way. We'll just use the logic model to do that. And there's some confusion sometimes of like, what's the theory of change? What's the logic model? The logic model is really the linear representation of our pathway to impact, whereas the theory of change typically is that more creative pathway representation on the visual side as well as the narrative side. And that is a little bit more sort of beefed up, if you will, to make sure that we're capturing all aspects and relationships for an organization. And what you'll see in a logic model is this pathway of input, activities, outputs, outcomes, and they're mapped from short-term, midterm, long-term, all the way to impact. And in there also, we have the problem statement, which is really the articulation of like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for from the impact perspective? We also have our assumptions, which are all the various, statements or ideas or theses that we're putting onto our pathway to impact that might not actually be based on evidence or based on data or based on, communication or engagement with our interest holders. And so it's really important to articulate those. Typically, what we do is we start with the problem statement, clearly stating what is the problem that we're trying to address in the work that we do. Whether, again, it's building a company, it's building a fund, selling a product, what is it that we're trying to solve for? And here it's also important, this is where some confusion happens, especially in the for-profit. When we work with our for-profit clients, this isn't necessarily the problem statement that's like, we're trying to address somebody's like problem of like trying to wake up in the morning. This is where we're talking about the problem statement that's related to a bigger societal or environmental challenge that our business is trying to address, right? So this is the problem statement of like, are we addressing climate change and perhaps access to energy solutions? Perhaps we're trying to address access to healthcare. Perhaps we're trying to address access to equitable education. It could be anything really that's related to what you're trying to do, but it's got to be relevant for your company and your organization. Now, in this model, as I mentioned, we've got these major category buckets in which we ask major questions, right? So in the input side, and we'll also share, for those of you that don't have it already, we do have a theory of change guidebook that can help with this process. And there's details there around like what questions you want to be asking in each of these categories to be able to work through with your own team. But inputs are really, what are the resources, all of the resources that are required for this pathway to work? And I should also actually roll back here quickly. We want to start after the problem statement. We want to start with impact. So we sort of work from the end in mind, as I mentioned before. What is the ultimate impact that we're trying to achieve with our work, right? Is it a systems change? Is it an environmental change? Is it a social change? What is it that we're trying to actually work towards? We want to work from there, from that point, and from that sort of like bigger North Star. We can then either work backwards or from inputs into impact. A lot of the times we'll go back and forth in this process to make sure we're capturing everything and that we're actually thinking again about this process from the right cause and effect perspective. So once we've got our impact, and maybe we'll start from the left and we start from the inputs, this is where we input all the resources that are required for this pathway to work, for perhaps our product to be developed, for the knowledge capital that we need to have in our business, from the individuals to the IP. Perhaps it's the capital that you require, perhaps it's partnerships, perhaps it's raw materials. It could be anything, right? What are all the inputs that are required for this model to work? When we move on to the activities, this is the major, like this is the big key part of the work you do. These are in the nonprofit side called interventions. And we could call them that here as well. You know, if your product is an intervention, what is it, right? What are the key activities that are going to lead to our impact at the end? And so we need to be really thinking about and asking, you know, how do these activities actually connect to the bigger impact? Do they actually connect to that bigger impact? And this is where we see we need to go back and forth a bit to make sure that we tease out any kind of operational activities that a lot of teams might have an urge to put in here, you know, whether it's fundraising or whether it's marketing elements or sales elements. Unless that activity, and in some cases it could be marketing, where education is a critical part of your actual model of impact, which is fine. But unless it's like unless it's that, if it's a regular marketing activity, it shouldn't go in here. This should very much focus on like, what are the key activities, products, services that we have to create, we have to realize in order for us to reach that bigger impact. It's also the core part of like who you are as a business, right? What is it that you do that you claim to make impact through? Then when we get into the next category, our outputs, this is where we actually have really tangible results, right? This is like how many products we sell. This is perhaps how many specific individuals that we get in front of. Perhaps it's how much carbon we, you know, take out of there. Perhaps it's how many trees we reforest. And so these are clear, measurable outputs that are a direct result. They're a direct result from the activities that we undertake. We then move on from the outputs into something that's a little bit more, even if it's a short-term outcome, long-term outcome. I'm going to talk about outcomes sort of in a bigger bucket here, because we can break them out into short-term, mid-term, long-term, longer term, and then into the systems impact that we then, you know, that we have at the very end. But outcomes in the very end are very specific to the changes we need to see in society or the environment or combination thereof that actually lead up to that bigger systems impact that we're trying to achieve, right? How do these outcomes actually relate to the larger systems impact that we're trying to achieve through, you know, the business that we're trying to build? Do those relate? Does the short term relate to the midterm, relate to the long term? What we typically see is that there are short term outcomes that relate to midterm outcomes that then lead to longer term outcomes that create the environment for that impact to be realized. So it's important, and this is where like the really hard work happens, right? Is being able to map all this out, to objectively look at it all, evaluate it, go back, reiterate, maybe map it out by the specific product, by the specific outcome. There's lots of different ways to map it out, but the time to do all of this work is in this process of the logic model, where we really try to do this in every way possible and try to really poke holes in our thinking and our assumptions that we're making about like, this is how we're going to create impact, when maybe in reality that might not actually be true, right? Where we say, oh, by selling this product, you know, we're going to, you know, make the world a greener place. Is that actually true? What evidence do we have to prove that? Can we actually say that that activity leads to the output, then that leads to that outcome, and short-term, long-term, et cetera? So really being able to evaluate it in a very objective way is very much a critical part of this work. Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing that part. I'm just looking at your questions. I'm going to share this slide now. Hopefully, I sort of made sense when I said the theory of change is really this bigger sort of pathway picture of our path to creating impact. It's usually visualized in a creative way. It always comes with a narrative that it's associated with. A logic model will include all of the aspects of our pathway. A theory of change often won't. The final theory of change might not include all the assumptions, might not include all of the sort of components or ideas that we come up with. Theory of change is much more focused on showing like the bigger theoretical picture, whereas the logic model will capture all of that because it is our tool to be able to capture all of that. And Sonali, yes, to your question, your output can be a KPI. It can be a key performance indicator. Typically, what we say is the output is, at that level is very much something that's tangible, something that we can measure, something that is directly related to the activity, or whether that's a sale of a product or the education of a certain group of individuals. It's that a specific output. So, all right. Okay, let me share this other part. Okay, so we'll try to speed through the last couple of bits so you have some time for questions. And so how do you design this process? Again, you want to make sure that you spend the time on this process. I mean, we at Ideas for Impact, we do sort of all ranges of time we spend with clients, everywhere from a couple hours to weeks on working on all of this. And it's typically embedded in a bigger strategic planning process that aligns with business objectives, right? So although it could be done independently, what we like to do is make sure that it is related to business objectives. We want to make sure it's related to strategic objectives. Otherwise, it becomes a little too difficult to have it just sitting on its own somewhere, right? We want to make sure it's embedded in the DNA of whatever we're doing in our organization. And the mistake is when it is left on its own in some silo and it isn't utilized. We want to make sure it's actually embedded in that strategic planning process and in the strategy. So we want to start with the core identity. We want to make sure that all of this work actually fits into and relates to that impact narrative that we are talking about, right? The core identity for a company, are we actually aligned there? Is impact present in the right way? Or are we starting to come in on some tangents that perhaps weren't as clear or perhaps weren't actually relevant, and being very diligent about making sure that we're evaluating that. We want to map out our logic model, making sure that we're actually connecting all of these aspects of the model, making sure we're connecting the outcomes with short-term outcomes, midterm outcomes, long-term outcomes, and making sure that we actually have a theory. Oh, am I not sharing my screen? Sharing it on one screen, but not the other. Thank you. Yeah, okay, now you can see. Nothing crazy on this slide. We want to make sure that over time, although we talked about having very clear KPIs on our logic model, or within that on the output side, We actually want to figure out how we define, how do we know we have reached an outcome, or how do we know we're getting close to reaching an outcome, right? So that can be a KPI, but it's also a bigger sort of thinking about how do we measure impact progress, right? It isn't just about the amount of products we sell or the revenue we have or the profit margin. It's very much related to an impact indicator that once we have a logic model or a theory of change or the combination of the, we can actually articulate what are the impact indicators that are related to our outcomes that we're seeking. So a little bit different than just the KPI. Now we're starting to talk about, like, are we actually thinking about impact indicators that are relevant for our business? Again, this is a caution of making sure you're not utilizing, every UN SDG on the list as your indicators. You want to be focused, you want to be specific. That is what's going to end up giving you the best results, right? It's not about having, 5 UN SDG indicators. It's about having 1 or 2 that are extremely relevant for the impact that you're trying to achieve, and then making sure that it's actually embedded in your theory of change, embedded in your strategic planning, etc. And so really important components. As you get working on a lot of this, making sure that you're actually, identifying your impact narrative as well. It will go in tandem with your theory of change visualization. But what is the story that you actually want to share with your audience, with those that follow you, with those that you want to, that are your interest holders, right? So customers, employees, board of directors, investors, whoever that might be, the communities you operate within. How do you identify that impact narrative? And we have a very simple formula here, which we always run everything through. It's, you want to, again, define the problem. What are you actually solving for? That is super, super important. You want to explain what you're actually doing, right? What is it that you're doing that's going to solve this problem? You want to highlight the outcomes that you seek to actually achieve. Are you looking, what is the actual measurable result, right? What's that outcome that you're seeking that you believe is going to lead to that impact? You want to be specific again about this. And this is why it's important to actually think about, okay, which indicator or indicators am I going to utilize that makes sense for me, that are not overwhelming, that are actually indicative of the ultimate change that I'm trying to showcase and that I'm trying to work towards. And then, of course, what is that long-term impact that you're trying to seek? And this is where we see a lot of impact companies that focus on impact, that do great work, that by all means are doing incredible work that's creating meaningful impact, is they don't talk about the impact that they are working towards, that they're achieving, whether that's in a theory of change or whether it's in their communications. They tend to focus on the transactional components of their business, right? Of their social enterprise. We want to see more companies actually focus on that impact and actually, talk about how that relates to that transactional piece. But too many are not actually looking at that longer term impact. And so making sure that you're thinking about that longer term impact is really important. Okay. This is going to be the last, the last slide. That might be a lot. And I'm just looking at the time, making sure everybody's got time for questions. If you've got any questions, pop them into the chat. How do we actually make this a living document, right? How do we make this a living framework where, again, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that it's not just a slide on a slide deck or a pitch deck. We don't want it to be just a page in a strategic plan that nobody looks at, right? We want to make sure that this is a framework. This is when it becomes powerful, is when we use it, not only when we create it, right? A lot of folks will think and mistake the process of creating a theory of change or creating a logic model, or for that matter, even creating a strategy, as the work the living of the work, but it's only the creation process. That's only the creation process of that particular, plan or product. It becomes a living document, and it becomes something really powerful when we actually utilize those plans, right? So that's also the case for the theory of change. It becomes really powerful when we utilize it as a living framework within our strategy. Mind you, the strategy also has to be a living framework, right? Are we actually checking in on our strategy that we've written monthly, quarterly, annually? How are we looking at it? This is a snapshot of some of the ways that we think about asking the questions around our framework. In every aspect and in every part of the theory of change, there are feedback loops that allow us to evaluate this cause and effect relationship that we've sort of put out there on paper or on our website or in our planning documents. We're saying this is how it works. This is how we believe our impact goals will be realized, and how our long-term change is going to actually take place. While we can poke holes in a lot of assumptions when we're going through the process of actually creating our theory of change or creating our logic model, some of it we won't be able to realistically test till we put it into action, right? So we won't be able to know if every input we've put down into that model is truly required unless we've tested it, unless we've gone out and said, okay, well, after this year of running through this model and trying to test it, we've actually realized that like this one input isn't actually required. It's an operational piece, sure, but it's not actually required to reach the impact that we seek to have or that we've identified. And so it's really important to really identify all of those aspects in terms of what that looks like for our particular model, right? Does the model actually, some of the other questions are like, how does the model actually clearly articulate the actions that lead to the intended impact that we want to see? Again, are there very clear cause and effect relationships that are present here? Can we actually follow them? Do they make sense? Do they make, like just from common sense, do they make sense? Are they evidence-based? How do we know these are true? Maybe over the year that we've put this theory of change into place, we're able to say, oh, this is true because we're now seeing this in our regular operations. We're actually tracking this month over month. We're looking at, what is working, what isn't working. Are we actually creating the outputs that then lead to those outcomes? And do the outputs actually reflect the outcomes that we are saying are going to actually happen over time, right? And, as you go through these models, and we didn't dive into all of this, but it's like, as you actually start putting timelines onto your outcomes and, your long-term systems change, you want to start giving those some like time parameters. What are we talking about when we talk short-term? Are we talking year, 3 years? In some cases, it's more than that, right? So, and again, it's unique to you and your particular situation and your particular business. And as you look at the top, we have some like bigger feedback loop questions that we want to ask at every sort of stage of the model, right? As we go and evaluate it. And typically this bigger evaluation we do on an annual basis after we've been able to run the tests and being able to run the model over that period of time, with having data and measurements over, over that 12 months or over 4 quarters, whatever, however you're measuring that. And start at the bottom, start to evaluate, like, is the work actually leading to systems change? Are the outputs actually reflecting actual meaningful impact? Do we need to recalibrate at any part of this model? If so, where does that need to happen? And how do we want to actually recalibrate? Are we actually building the wrong product? Or perhaps we are building a product that might be meeting a different a problem out there, right? So there's a lot of different elements here. And again, there's so much to evaluate and so much to discern once we start building the model and once we start testing the model. It is about, spending the time with your team or with your leadership team or with your board or whoever is involved in this, to actually be able to effectively ask a lot of these questions as you get going in actually implementing this in your organization. So again, you want to do this regularly. You want to have some really clear feedback loops that you're building into your model and into your business. And you want to make sure that this is aligned with your business goals, right? You need them to be. Otherwise, again, it sort of sits outside and isn't embedded into the core operations of what you're trying to achieve. And I think that of all of that, that is so important. You want to make sure if you're trying to embed impact into a for-profit environment, you've got to make sure that the strategic business goals are deeply aligned with the impact goals and the impact pathway that you're trying to build. So there's so much opportunity here for you to create impact. Of course, you're all here, I hope, and I imagine that you're either trying to realize this in real life or try to articulate it in a better way in your organization or your company or in the work that you do. There's so much more that we can all achieve and we can all learn from this is if we're very intentional about not only what we're trying to do, but how we're designing that change that we're trying to create. We're going to be so much more capable of achieving it, being able to meaningfully measure impact, and of course, also be able to scale it if that is the intention. So that's it for today. I'm just going to quickly go over again. This webinar's intention is not to sell you anything. It's really just to share our knowledge with you. The way we work is we work as a fractional impact team with organizations. We do strategic planning processes. We do theory of change workshops. We do work with some organizations to actually build entire impact frameworks that include theory of change and much, much more. And if you're curious about more of our work, by all means, get in touch. This is the way to where to find myself. Yes, so we'll share all the links. We've got a podcast we produce. We've got a Substack that we run with a lot of content. We have a YouTube channel that we're building out. And you can always get in touch with us by email. You've got questions about the process, about how to include it in your particular organization. We're more than happy to have those discussions. We will be sharing the recording and all the links. In the new year, we're going to be actually hosting some office hours around this towards the end of January. So look out for that. Again, please let me know if you've got any questions. Other than the recording, yes, the recording will be shared. But as I mentioned, you can also email or get in touch on LinkedIn. Really appreciate everybody being here and spending your morning or your afternoon with me. Greatly appreciate it. And if this has been helpful on your impact journey, again, please let me know. I'd love to hear more about what you're working on and how we can be of service. Yes, thanks, John. Thank you. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you over on email.